What's up, guys? So this is a smart article. It's by Colin Woodward. It's from September 21st, 2017. It talks about the 11 settler cultures of North America. Why am I calling them settler cultures instead of nations? Well, they're settler colonies, right? They were founded by foreigners in America, right? I can't deny the fact that I'm a foreigner in America and my DNA proves it, right? 27% Welsh, 21% French, 0.40% Spanish, 15.47% Palestinian and Lebanese, 10% Saudi, 20% Iraqi, 2% Georgian, 1% Mexican, right? That's my background. That's how my background breaks down to, right? So earlier this summer, this is by Colin Woodward, The 11 Nations of North America as Told by DNA. North America was settled by what were in effect separate nations, and the proof may reach into your DNA. So earlier this summer, I presented the American nations, the 11 regional cultures that comprise the United States and North America. Their existence explains much about our history, our constitutional arrangements, and indeed our political fissures, past and present. If you have any ancestors who were living in North America prior to the Civil War, the existence of these rival nations is likely reflected in parts of your family tree, and according to a recent study published in Nature Communications, may very well have left a mark on your DNA. I couldn't miss the study because shortly after it came out, readers of my 2011 book, American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of the United States, were stuffing my inbox and flooding my social media feeds with it. A glance at the thumbnail illustration that accompanied the study made it clear why. Unbeknownst to the scientists who written the paper, the map depicting the key results of their research on the genetic patterns of genetic variation in North America over time and space mirrored the American nations map to an uncanny degree. Here they are for comparison. And I'm going to make a quick comment here. My favorite region in America is the left coast, where you have Seattle, you have Portland, you have San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose. You know, it's a place that's a great place to be left wing. Now, I don't condone settler colonialism, and we do have to recognize these are all settler colonies. This is Duwamish territory. This is Kalapuya territory. This is Ohlone territory, right? You got to say what it is. Likewise, I do like New Netherland, which is Brooklyn and Queens and Yonkers and the Bronx and Jersey City and Patterson. Obviously, that's Lenape territory. I do like Boston. Obviously, that's Pequot territory. So, yeah, just had to put those disclaimers out there. But then here's the map of settler migrations. So, you see here, Portuguese in the Bay, English from the Northeast in Utah, New Mexicans, so Spanish people and Mexicans, right? Acadians and French Canadians, Scandinavians, Finnish, Lower South, Upland South, Lower Midwest, and Appalachians. Those are all English and Scots-Irish. Dominicans, Caribbeans, mix of Spanish, African, and Taino. So this is remarkable because the American nations paradigm is resolutely not about genetics or genealogy. Rather, it's built on the late cultural geographer Wilbur Zielinski's doctrine of first effective settlement, which argues that when a new society is settled, the cultural characteristics of the initial settlement group will have a lasting and outsized effect on the future trajectory of that society. Even if their numbers were very small and those of later immigrants of different origins were very large, these lasting characteristics, which inform the dominant culture of entire regions of North America, are passed down culturally and not genetically, which explains why the Dutch settled area around New York City still has obvious and distinct characteristics inherited from Golden Age Amsterdam, even though the portion of people there reporting Dutch ancestry to census takers is vanishingly small, 0.2%, and mostly in Flatbush. Culture is learned, not inherited, as far as I know, mostly in Flatbush. And yet, the Nature study, powered by the enormous cross-reference genomics and genealogy bases of Ancestry.com, reveals that regional cultures have left a significant imprint as well. That's because members of a regional culture tend to mate with one another rather than with people from rival areas, even though even when those rivals lived nearby in the very same colony or town. Who we are today, the genetics of Americans all over the place, is the result of all kinds of cycles of reproduction isolation and the release of isolation, says Catherine A. Ball, a geneticist and the chief scientific officer at Ancestry.com, who oversees the company's DNA work. Who your mates would be was linked to geography, politics, religion, war, and all of that is showing today in people walking on the streets and who they are related to. Ball wasn't familiar with the American nations before I spoke with her, but the results show that the boundaries of regional cultures were very real when it came to human reproduction, creating reproductive clusters centuries ago that geneticists have been able to recreate through examination of nearly 1 million living Americans' DNA. The Ancestry team, led by In-Jung Han, built their map without reference to culture, geography, or history. Rather, they worked with a database of DNA of 770,000 people worldwide who asked the company or its predecessors to sequence their genes and gave permission to use it for scientific research. Almost all those people were Americans. The company is based in San Francisco and Utah and devoted most of its marketing dollars to the mail and Ancestry DNA genetics kits in the United States. Utahns are slightly overrepresented because the database started its life at BYU and the students provided many of the initial samples. There was no screening by citizenship, ethnicity, race, gender, or anything else apart from a willingness to pay $99 for the test. The only criteria for inclusion into this network is that you spit in a tube, gave me your DNA, and consented to be part of the research, notes Ball. Via computers, the researchers build a network showing genetic connections between all the people in the database, searching for and isolating clusters, constellations, if you will, of more closely related people. Because most of the participants had also created genealogies on the company's website, the researchers were also then able to cross-reference their clusters with the actual birthplaces of each individual's ancestors going back several, sometimes 10 or more generations. And I can trace my family on Ancestry DNA on my maternal grandpa's side back to Palestine, Syria, and Saudi, and to a lesser extent, Yemen. And the genetic clusters often corresponded with geographic clusters. And then those ancestors in specific migrated to New York, then to Massachusetts, and then to Alaska. The genetic clusters often corresponded with geographic clusters as researchers went back in time several generations, revealing the reproductive geography of that given cluster. The maps you see above and dozens of others in Nature Communications, in the Nature Communications article and supplementary materials generally show ancestral birthplace location clusters for people born between the 1640s and 1880s. Yeah, mine's all clusters around New York in that specific time period. A period that captures significant immigration waves, but focuses on a time before North Americans became highly mobile. Our hypothesis was that where I live today is not going to tell us a lot about my ancestors, my genetics, but where my ancestors were living 200 or 300 years ago, that will tell us something, says Ball. Their top-level map reveals that almost all major reproductive clusters correspond exactly to American nation boundaries, including those mirroring Yankeedom, which researchers term the Northeastern Utah, Midlands, Pennsylvania, and Deep South, Lower South. 3 other nations are plotted, but are shown to have 2 distinct clusters. New France, divided, not surprisingly, between the settlers with origins in Quebec and settlers with origins in Acadia. And El Norte, where, again, unsurprisingly, the 17th century Nuevo Mexicanos are distinguished from the 18th and 19th century Northeast Mexico wave, like up through Monterrey and stuff. Greater Appalachia, where the Appalachian Mountains split settlers into a northern and southern tier, what the Ancestry team terms Upland South and Lower Midwest, and Appalachians. Significantly, the original home turfs of 2 smaller nations the study didn't track, New Netherland, Tidewater, are blank from the map, indicating reproductive isolation from larger cultures that did map here. So mine's would be from so my family on my maternal grandpa's side migrated from Palestine, Saudi, Lebanon, and France to New York. On my paternal grandpa's side, they went from England and Wales to Massachusetts. My maternal grandma's side went from Lebanon, France, and Palestine to Pennsylvania. I wouldn't have expected research based on genetic sequence of today's Americans to support my assertions that eastern Oklahoma and Texas Hill Country are part of Greater Appalachia, that Michigan is part of Yankee Greater New England, that southern Louisiana and the river counties are New France, and that Central Florida, or at least used to belong, to the Deep South. But there they are, plotted on a map created via an entirely different and unrelated methodology. So overseas origins revealed, others are more subtle assertions, and American nations are substantiated as well. The book describes how Scandinavian immigrants were attracted to the Yankee frontier and embraced by the region's cultural elites. That's why you have a bunch of Swedes. You have hella Swedes in Chicago and hella Norwegians and Icelandics in Minneapolis, partly because of their shared cultural beliefs. Ancestry's research confirms their clustering in the Yankee portions, and only Yankee portions, of northern Iowa and the easternmost Dakotas. Two places I will never visit. The book shows that the Deep South's cultural and socioeconomic origins tie back to the English slave state of Barbados. The genetics researchers identified as an African-American cluster encompassing the Deep South and former British possessions in the Caribbean, including the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands, St. Lucia, and Grenada, but not Spanish Caribbean possessions like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Dominican Republic. An important point: it's almost impossible for descendants of enslaved people to track their ancestors' genealogies, which is why the ancestry cluster data for this cluster doesn't track back to the African continent. But one can assume that it would be mainly Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, Liberia, those places, right? Conversely, the people with roots in the Spanish Caribbean avoided the Deep South entirely, settling in the Midlands, Philly, and New Netherland, New York and New Jersey, instead, despite the greater physical and environmental differences at play. It seems as if the South is backwards, which we're getting to my thesis statement, right? So if you see the cluster, you got Kanaka and Hawaii, Utah, you got English people, okay? You got Germans in Kansas, you got African Americans in the South, Scots-Irish in the Appalachians, Germans in Pennsylvania, Russian Jews in New York, and Irish in Nova Scotia and Maine and Massachusetts. Note that while Tidewater and Deep South were slave societies, ones where slavery was the central organizing principle of the economy and social order, the clusters have labeled African American. The cluster's researchers have labeled African American comprises only the Deep South. In fact, it follows my Deep South borders with eerie precision, including those that split Arkansas in half and divide the area around Memphis from the rest of Appalachian Tennessee. But it doesn't extend in the Tidewater, save for parts of eastern North Carolina, suggesting less commerce in slaves between the regions than I would have expected. Somewhere in the ancestry DNA, there's presumably less robust clusters centered on the Chesapeake that corresponds to Tidewater African Americans, but it didn't make it into the published results. The researchers, who included computational experts from the University of Michigan and Carnegie Mellon and African American history expert from Harvard, also traced reproductive clusters in the lowlands of Alabama and Mississippi back to their colonial era origins on the coast of South Carolina. Just as American nations would have predicted, this is where the Deep South spread from. And the ancestors of their Quebecois and Acadian cluster members were both found to be concentrated along the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel coast of France. Oh, the Mar Cantabrico, La Costa Cantabrica, that coast, yeah. With few linking back to Paris, the south or west, corresponding with historical research. The reproductive clusters of the two halves of Appalachia have nearly identical patterns of their European ancestors, both with the expected concentrations in Scotland and the north of Ireland, reflecting that they are in reality two branches of a single immigration wave. Reflecting census data, the researchers found that 19th century immigrants, be they Amish, Mennonites, or from southern and eastern Europe, East Asia, or the Spanish Caribbean, avoided settling in the Deep South and Greater Appalachia, and several waves avoided the Tidewater as well. Again, all of that reflects to my family's history. So you see, my family is... So yes, 27% of my family is Welsh. They migrated to Massachusetts. They settled in Massachusetts. French settled in New York. Palestinian and Lebanese settled in New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Saudi settled in New York. Iraqi settled in Illinois and Chicago. Now, why do we differentiate Chicago from the rest of Illinois? Well, you see here on the map, while southern Illinois is Greater Appalachia and the Midlands, Chicago and Greater Chicagoland belongs to Yankeedom. So basically, my family settled in, to a lesser extent, in the Midlands, New Netherland, Yankeedom, a tiny bit of Appalachia. Yeah, New Netherland, Yankeedom, the Midlands, and a teeny tiny bit of Appalachia. But most of them, where did they settle? Yankeedom and New Netherland. But the fact that most of them avoided Appalachia, and you can look at their nationalities, French, Palestinian, Lebanese, Saudi, Iraqi, and the fact they avoided Appalachia and they chose to settle in New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and and then Chicago, in Illinois, the Greater Chicagoland area, slightly north of Chicago. Well, that tells you how bad and how shitty the South is, right? And also the fact that 19th century immigrants, be they Amish, Mennonites, or from southern and eastern Europe, East Asia, or Spanish Caribbean, avoided settling in the Deep South and Greater Appalachia, and waves avoided the Tidewater as well. That's just a fancy way to say these guys hated the South because the South's a shithole, and they went to places like Boston, New York, Philly, Chicago, Detroit, and on the West Coast, obviously, places like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. Interesting. Ancestral lines lost or detected. There are a few minor surprises from the data from an American nation's point of view. Although there's no doubt that South Central Pennsylvania was the original center of the Greater Appalachian settlement, neither ancestry's Appalachian reproductive clusters revolve around it. Instead, the area adjacent to the portions of West Virginia are part of the Midlands equivalent Pennsylvania cluster, suggesting, at very least, that there was a substantial intermarriage between these settlement streams. Okay, no wonder my brother's backwards. Because again, my maternal grandma's family mostly went to this area of central PA. Actually, this is the town my maternal grandma was born in. Her family was Lebanese, Palestinian, and French. But from eastern France, from Alsace, Lebanese from Mount Lebanon Governorate, Palestinian, most likely from Bet Sahor. Okay. So, also because 96% of the DNA samples are from people born in the U.S., the research was largely blind to reproductive clusters that were exported from the United States, like the post-revolutionary migrations of Midlanders to what is now southern Ontario, or of New England Yankees to parts of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. I have 2 cousins in southern Ontario, so that's pretty interesting. It's likely also the reason that the maps crop out much of Canada and Alaska. There's not enough data to generate meaningful clusters. Alaska had just 748 samples with corresponding genealogies. And the information for the region I call First Nation, which in my work includes large parts of Alaska and most of the Canadian North, is extremely thin. Only 451 samples in the study were estimated to be overwhelmingly Native American, and most of those were from the Mexican clusters. Perhaps Native Americans feel less uncertain about where their ancestors came from. And actually, that's what I've seen from being in Alaska all these years. But Ancestry's database is growing by hundreds of thousands each year, holding promise of more detailed migration analysis in the future. Ball told me that in 3 years since the study began, the network of researchable samples has grown from 770,000 to nearly 2 million for some ancestral lines, like from those places where older birth records were destroyed in wars or countries or cultures that didn't keep them in written form at all. Finding corresponding genealogical information will likely remain a challenge, but for others, reconstructing migration and settlement patterns is slated to become easier than ever. Yeah, so like in America, so this is where my family migrated to originally, but in America, most of my cousins are either in Central PA, Northern California, or Western Washington, or Southern California. So, I mean, you do the math. You tell me what that means. So, there you go. And it explains why I hate the South, right? Also, the fact that, again, I'm half West Asian. I have roots in Palestine, Lebanon, Saudi, Iraq, Georgia. And then in terms of Europe, I have roots in France as well. France, you know, deep roots in northern Iraq. So you tell me what that means. But from what I know what it means I hate the South. And I think the South is a shithole. So there you go. Yeah, so there you go.